So now we're going to use the Dye Based Markers, and we're going to use them directly on our stamp and create kind of a watercolor effect. Penny Black has a bunch of these different stamps that have kind of a brush stroke, kind of a watercolor look to them that are fun to use. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking my marker, I'm taking the brush end of my marker. These ones have a fine end and a brush end. I'm using the brush end for all of it for this, and I'm coloring directly onto the stamp. Now while I'm coloring on the stamp, the ink will dry on that stamp, but what we can do then is mist it with some water and then stamp it, and it'll create a watercolor effect. So as you can see, some of the colors are pretty easy to see as I'm coloring them. The lighter colors are a lot harder to see on the stamp, but I always work from light to dark, because if I get some light marker on this dark one, it's not going to really ruin my marker. And if I get some dark marker onto my light one, it's not going to necessarily ruin the marker, but I don't want to color expecting this light color and then get a dark purple with it, whereas that's not going to happen with the dark purple here. So my flowers are done, and now I'm going to do my greenery. So I have two different greens here. There's not a whole lot of difference between the two of them, but I do still like to use a darker one to add a bit of shading. I think it just gives it a bit more of a realistic look, as well as the fact that I find when you use multiple colors, it just gives it more dimension. So light color done. The dark one is going on the bottoms of the greens, and anywhere there would be a little bit of a shadow. So right at the bottom of the leaf there, underneath that flower. There we go. So now I'm taking my misting bottle, and all you do is mist it 2 or 3 times just to get a light mist over it. I don't want it drenched, because if it's drenched, you're going to lose some of the detail of the flower. So I'm trying to get it wet enough so that the ink is wet and it's going to transfer really well, but I'm not trying to ruin much of the detail. And I'm going to do one from this side. There we go. And you want to make sure that you have a mister for this that gives a nice fine mist. This one here, I did get a few drops with it, but that's okay. But in general, I want one that kind of has a fine overall mist, and I like this mister for it. This one, if you're pushing the lever or the trigger or whatever all the way, you tend to get a fine mist, and if you push it part of the way, you get it kind of spits. All right, so I'm going to lift that up. There's still a bunch of ink on there. We're going to use it for another card in the next section, so don't clean your stamp off. But there we have our image. I'm going to let that completely dry, and while that is drying, I'm going to just add a sentiment to the bottom. And this one I'm using an ink pad to ink the stamp because it's a close enough purple for me. You could use the purple marker that we just used and color it. But in that case, instead of spraying it with water, you would huff on it as if you were like cleaning it. You know how you huff on glasses to clean them? You would do that. You want some moist air to rehydrate the ink so that you can stamp it. For something this detailed, if we were to mist it with water, you would lose all the detail and your stamp would pretty much, or your sentiment would pretty much be smeared. But there we go. We're just gonna dry that quickly a second. And it shouldn't take too long because there's really not a whole lot of water that we added. We just did enough to get the detail or the stamp to transfer over. Because for a stamp this big, by the time you finish coloring it, the first colors that you used are all dried. So that is good enough there. Once again, I've got my pieces already cut. And you'll see that there wasn't as much water, so this one didn't bend nearly as much as the other ones did. I'm using a liquid adhesive to glue my cards together just because I like it so that if by chance, oh, I got a drip of water on there, so let's put the glue on this side. If by chance I don't place it correctly the first time, I can move it and adjust it, whereas with a just a double-sided adhesive, you don't sometimes have that leeway, but you could, if you like it using a tape runner, you could use a tape runner for this. It doesn't necessarily have to be a liquid adhesive. I tend to find that my liquid adhesives, though, last way longer than my tape runners do. All right, this one you need to hold it down for just a couple seconds because it is bent. And I am going to, after I turn the camera off, I'm going to put an acrylic block and a weight on there to finish drying it. But there we go, our first card. In the next video, I'll show you what we do with the remaining ink on the pad, or on the stamp.